and study with Tanzania Institute of Education.
Hello students, my name is Mr. Gideon John. I'll be with you in history subject. And our topic of our discussion today is colonial economy. Colonial economy. Colonial economy. And our subtopic will be establishment of colonial economy in Africa. Establishment of colonial economy in Africa. Establishment of colonial economy in Africa. Economy in Africa. Dear students, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to explain the meaning and objectives of colonial economy, as well as you'll be able to identify the characteristics of colonial economy in Africa. But before we begin our lesson, would you please find a piece of paper or an exercise book or a notebook and a pen where you'll be able to take down some hints as far as our discussion is concerned. Before we begin our lesson, let us understand the concept of colonial economy itself. First of all, we need to ask ourselves, what is colonial economy? Colonial economy can be defined as the system, the meaning of colonial economy, meaning of colonial economy, Colonial economy can be defined as the system of production and consumption of cash crops and minerals established in African colonies by the colonialists in order to fulfill their economic demands. The economic demands we are talking about here refers to those capitalist demands, such as markets, areas for settlement, areas for investments, and African cheap labor as well. Having seen the meaning of colonial economy, now, after European states had taken over African colonies, the next step was to establish colonial economy. This was basically the primary purpose of European conquest on Africa during the last quarter of 19th century. Dear students, now let us discuss the objectives of colonial economy. What were the objectives of colonial economy? Let us now look on the objectives of colonial economy. Objectives of colonial economy. The objectives of the colonial economy were most shaped by the interest of the capitalist nations itself. And the major objectives of colonial economy in Africa were as follows. First of all, our colonies were expected to provide raw materials. The raw materials which were expected to be provided by the African colonies were both minerals and agricultural related raw materials. And the most needed raw materials by the time was cocoa, coffee, sisal, tea, and rubber, among others. Also, another objective of colonial economy, we say African colonies were also expected to provide cheap labor. And this was due to the demands raised by European workers in terms of high salaries, social services, insurance, as well as good working conditions. Therefore, European nations decided to come in Africa to establish colonial economy so that they'll be able to acquire African cheap laborers, since European capitalists wanted to maximize their profit by using African cheap laborers. Apart from that, also can see that another objective of colonial economy, we say colonies were also expected to import European manufactured goods. To import European manufactured goods. And this was followed by the so-called Industrial Revolution in Europe, whereby most of European powers were producing industrial goods in excess. But by the time in Europe, there was scarcity of markets. Therefore, during colonial economy, European manufactured goods had to be imported in Africa so that Africans will be the final consumers of European manufactured goods. And the goods which were imported during this time were, for example, cigarettes, butter, sugar, and liquor. To mention few of them. Nevertheless, there are also another objectives of colonial economy in Africa. Also said, African colonies were expected to be self-supporting. When we say African colonies were expected to be self-supporting, it means the colonized Africans were supposed to raise revenues that will help support administrative costs of their colony. And this could be achieved through imposition of different forms of taxes on Africans. For example, they imposed taxes such as hat tax, poly tax or head tax, which had to be paid by every adult African males. Dear students, after having discussed the objectives of colonial economy, now let us move into characteristics of colonial economy. Colonial economy has got its characteristics. And here are some of the characteristics or features of colonial economy in Africa. Characteristics of colonial economy in Africa. Yes, the first and the foremost characteristic of colonial economy, we say it was an import-export oriented economy. This is in the sense that Africans specialized in production of raw materials for export, and also in turn were expected to receive or to import European manufactured goods in Africa. In other words, it's fair to say that by an import-export oriented economy, that means Africans produced what they did not consume and consumed what they didn't produce. Another characteristic or feature of colonial economy in Africa, we say it involved the construction of physical infrastructures. The physical infrastructures which were characterized by colonial economy in Africa included roads, railways, harbors, and ports. These helped to transport raw materials from production areas to the coast. Therefore, the physical infrastructures provided a link between the coast and production areas. For example, the British in East Africa built the Uganda railway line, which started at Mombasa along the coast in the year 1896 and reached Kisumu along the shores of Lake Victoria in the year 1901. Such as Uganda Railway Line, which were built in the year 1895 and completed in the year 1901. Apart from construction of physical infrastructures, another feature or characteristic of colonial economy, we say colonial economy involved the introduction. There was an introduction of monetization. There was an introduction of monetization. And this, it was only European currencies that were allowed to be used as a medium of exchange in the colonies. This was introduced purposely so as to force Africans to offer their labor power on colonial economic sectors. Therefore, in order for an African to get money, he had to offer his or her labor power into colonial economic sectors, such as mining centers, colonial plantations, as well as settler farms. Another characteristic of colonial economy, we say it involved massive land alienation. Colonial governments took the African arable land and gave it to few European capitalists who were engaged themselves in agricultural activities. By doing so, majority of Africans became landless. Now, in order to sustain their lives, they had to look for jobs towards the colonialists so as to earn low wages, which helped them to sustain their living expenses. Nevertheless, also colonial economy, we say it had limited capital. Colonial economy, since its establishment and development, its capital mainly depended on the revenues collected on the colonies. Therefore, Africans had to pay tax in different forms, and the tax collected from Africans helped to run the expenses of the colonies. Therefore, we say it had limited capital. Few expenses were set aside by the European governments in Europe for the running of African colonies. Therefore, in other words, we can say Africans were paying for their own exploitation. Dear students, and that is the end of our discussion today. Remember, today we have discussed, or we have learned, the meaning of colonial economy, Also, we saw the objectives for the establishment of colonial economy in Africa, as well as the characteristics or features of colonial economy in Africa. Now, and that's the end of our discussion for today. But before we close our lesson, I'd like to give you an exercise or a homework for you to do. Here, it is an exercise. It says, explain six characteristics of colonial economy in Africa. Okay, when we meet next time, we are going to make correction of an exercise I gave you, and we shall proceed with the same subtopic, particularly on the techniques or methods which were used to establish colonial economy in Africa. Thank you for listening. See you next time.